For most investors, markets feel liquid right up until the moment they aren't. Prices still trade, indexes still move, headlines still sound confident. But inside institutions, liquidity is treated very differently. It is not assumed, it is monitored. And when it starts to feel conditional, behavior changes quietly. Before stress shows up on screens, large institutions begin reducing exposure in specific places. Not because something is broken, but because they do not want to be forced to act later. These are not dramatic exits, they are small, methodical reductions that only make sense if liquidity is no longer taken for granted. In this video, I want to show you 3 positions institutions consistently scale back when liquidity starts to tighten, and why those reductions tend to appear while markets still look calm. Inside large institutions, liquidity is rarely discussed in absolute terms. It is not treated as something that exists or does not exist. It is treated as a condition that can change depending on context, counterparties, and timing. A position that looks liquid on a screen can behave very differently when many participants need to move at once. Because of that, institutions spend far more time thinking about how they would exit than why they entered. This is why the earliest adjustments are rarely visible to outsiders. They do not show up as sharp moves or sudden reallocations. They show up as hesitation, as restraint, as a quiet change in posture. The first area where this becomes visible is not in core holdings, but around the edges of portfolios. Institutions tend to structure exposure in layers. There is capital that is meant to stay deployed through most conditions, and capital that is designed to be flexible. The flexible layer is where behavior shifts first. This layer often includes equity exposure that exists outside of long-term mandates, tactical allocations, factor strategies, satellite positions that are justified as incremental rather than essential. These positions are not wrong, they are not flawed. They simply rely on the assumption that liquidity will be available if needed. When liquidity is abundant, these positions grow almost by default. Allocations drift higher, rebalancing favors them. Risk budgets allow them to persist because exiting is assumed to be straightforward. But when liquidity starts to feel conditional, even subtly, these same positions are treated differently. The change doesn't begin with selling, it begins with stopping. New capital isn't added. Allocations that would normally be topped up are left unchanged. Rebalancing becomes asymmetric. Trimming happens more easily than adding. Over time, exposure declines without a clear moment where anyone can point and say a decision was made. As these reductions take place, markets can still look healthy. Index levels don't need to change. Volatility doesn't need to rise. Aggregate exposure can still appear elevated, especially at the index level. But internally, the composition of that exposure has shifted. Positions that were easiest to adjust are reduced first. Exposure that required less explanation, less coordination, and less urgency quietly shrinks. What remains is more rigid, more mandate-driven, and harder to move. From the outside, it can look like institutions are still fully committed, but the quality of exposure is different. The flexible layer has thinned. Positions that are harder to move are left for later, or protected by mandates that make them more difficult to touch. The second area where institutions begin to scale back is less visible and often misunderstood. It involves exposure that is defined not by asset class, but by time. Long-duration commitments occupy a special place in institutional portfolios because they assume stability over extended periods. They assume funding remains available, they assume refinancing options remain open, they assume secondary markets remain functional. When liquidity is taken for granted, duration is not treated as a risk in itself. It is treated as a source of return. Longer commitments are rewarded for patience and illiquidity is compensated. But when liquidity starts to feel conditional, duration becomes something to manage rather than harvest. Again, the adjustment is rarely dramatic. Institutions do not rush to sell long-duration assets into functioning markets. Instead, they focus on what they do not do next. Commitments that roll off are not renewed. New allocations are delayed without fanfare. Extensions that would normally be approved are postponed. In some cases, internal thresholds for acceptable duration are adjusted quietly, making certain investments ineligible without explicitly banning them. From the outside, nothing appears wrong. The assets remain on balance sheets. Prices may not move at all. There is no visible stress. but the pipeline begins to dry up. This behavior is easiest to observe in environments where commitments require periodic reaffirmation, funds that rely on capital being rolled forward, structures that assume refinancing, arrangements where maturity dates matter even if they are not immediately pressing. When institutions grow less confident in future liquidity conditions, they become less willing to extend their own exposure into the future, not because they expect a specific event, but because flexibility becomes more valuable than incremental return. The key point is that this is not a judgment on asset quality. Institutions may still believe these positions are sound. They may still believe the underlying economics are intact, but belief is not the same as preference. Preference shifts toward positions that can be adjusted incrementally, without coordination and without time pressure. Long duration exposure, by definition, limits those options. As a result, duration shortens across portfolios in ways that are difficult to track. It does not show up as selling pressure, it shows up as absence. Fewer new deals, smaller allocations, more selective participation. The third area institutions reduce is the most abstract but often the most telling. It involves positions that depend on complexity functioning smoothly, trades that require multiple conditions to remain stable at the same time, tight spreads, continuous funding, predictable correlations, cooperative counterparties. These positions often perform extremely well when markets are calm. Complexity allows for efficiency. Risk can be distributed, optimized, and layered. Returns can be enhanced without appearing concentrated. As long as everything works, complexity is an advantage. But complexity is also where friction hides. And friction is what institutions become sensitive to when liquidity starts to feel conditional. As soon as there is any reason to believe that execution might become less predictable, these positions lose appeal. Not because they are failing, but because exiting them under stress would require everything to work at once. The reduction process is subtle. Position sizes are trimmed. Leverage is adjusted downward. Trades that require frequent rebalancing are simplified. In some cases, exposure is maintained but hedged in ways that reduce dependence on perfect execution. What disappears first are trades that require constant attention, strategies that depend on small price discrepancies, structures that assume counterparties will always show up, and positions where exit depends on precise timing. Institutions do not announce these changes. Internally, they are framed as risk hygiene, process alignment, and balance sheet discipline. But the effect is meaningful. As complexity-dependent exposure is reduced, markets can become less resilient even while appearing stable. Liquidity can still exist, but it becomes more fragmented. Fewer participants are willing to intermediate under stress. Fewer balance sheets are committed to smoothing disruptions. This is why liquidity can appear abundant until it suddenly is not. The infrastructure that makes it reliable has already been thinned out. What is important to understand is that none of these adjustments require fear. They do not require conviction about outcomes. Institutions are large, and behavior often emerges from process rather than shared belief. Risk limits are adjusted, guidelines evolve, portfolio construction changes incrementally. Each shift is small and defensible on its own. No one needs to agree on why exposure is being reduced. No single view needs to dominate. The behavior does not depend on a unified outlook, only on a shared preference for remaining unforced. This is why these reductions tend to appear while markets still look calm. Prices are not the trigger. Optionality is. Institutions care deeply about not being forced to act. Forced action is where losses compound, reputations suffer, and careers end. Avoiding that scenario is worth sacrificing some upside. So exposure is reduced where it can be reduced quietly, where exits do not require speed, where adjustments do not attract attention. These are not exits in the way most people think about exits. They are not bets against markets. They are decisions about where not to be constrained. As these behaviors accumulate, they create a market that is outwardly stable but inwardly less flexible. Liquidity still exists, but it is more conditional. It depends more on context, sentiment, and coordination. From the outside, this is almost impossible to observe in real time. The data does not scream. Headlines do not change. But inside institutions, the posture is different. Exposure is held with less enthusiasm. Duration is managed more tightly. Complexity is treated with suspicion. None of this resolves uncertainty. It does not answer questions about what comes later. It simply reflects a preference to remain unforced. And that preference, once it spreads, changes how markets behave under pressure. What makes this dynamic difficult to recognize is that it does not follow a clean sequence. There is no clear start or end, no signal that can be pointed to with certainty. It is a gradual reorientation. One institution reduces marginal exposure, another shortens duration, another simplifies its book. Each does so for internal reasons that may have nothing to do with one another, but the effect is cumulative. Liquidity becomes something that exists conditionally. It is there when not everyone needs it. It is there when adjustments are small. It is there when timing is flexible. But the margin for error shrinks. This is why institutional behavior often looks disconnected from market narratives. While public discourse focuses on confidence and momentum, internal discussions are about process, constraints, and exit mechanics. Institutions are not trying to be right. They are trying to avoid being trapped. And the ways they do that are rarely dramatic. They reduce exposure where exits would be awkward. They avoid commitments that assume stability. They simplify trades that depend on smooth coordination. Each decision makes sense in isolation. None of them predicts anything. None of them needs to. They simply reflect a shift in how liquidity is treated, not as something guaranteed, but as something that might need to be accessed without notice. And once that mindset takes hold, behavior changes quietly, unevenly, and without resolution. Markets can continue to function. Prices can continue to move. Confidence can remain high. But the underlying structure is no longer the same. And that difference only becomes visible when it matters, which is precisely why institutions adjust before they are asked to. This is not a story with an ending. It is an observation of posture. The reductions do not signal what will happen. They only show what institutions prefer not to test. And for now, that preference is expressed in silence.